Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm a PhD candidate here at Bowling Green State University in the American Cultural Studies program. And my dissertation that I'm just getting started on is about, broadly, it's about how the United States uses media and pop culture and civil society as a tool to advance its economic and security interests abroad in foreign policy, specifically looking at the US Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy. These are two institutions that show up very prominently if you're involved in like left-wing circles and keep up with left-wing politics. These things come up when we're talking about international issues all the time, but there hasn't been a whole lot of writing on these two institutions and their influences and the broader history that they make up. So just some scholarship to give people a little background. Some literature I'm using is around media imperialism, working with Oliver Boyd Barrett. This book is over there. This literature looks at the intersections between, media and imperialism. Perhaps the most famous book that comes out of this is The Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. And just last year, there was this great documentary that came out, Theaters of War, How the CIA and Pentagon Took Hollywood. If you get a chance to check that out, it's a great introduction to these things. And I'm also looking a little bit at deep politics. Perhaps the most famous theorist of this literature is Peter Dale Scott, who kind of defined a lot of this. And he defines deep politics here as all of those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. So things like the CIA, very important for my research. So it's important to get a broader history and understanding of that. So as a historical background to USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, you have what was called the Cultural Cold War, written most famously by Frances Stoner Saunders in her book, Who Paid the Piper. And if you look at this history, you find that from the beginning of the CIA until these things were exposed in the late 60s, the CIA covertly cultivated what was called a non-communist left by funding US and international artistic and intellectual publications and endeavors, labor unions, student organizations, women's organizations, minority organizations, labor unions, probably most importantly out of all of them. Also journals, intellectual journals, journalistic associations, newspapers, things like that. Here I have a little image of kind of caricaturing this of the like CIA agents shaking down the London Symphony Orchestra and the journalists. They weren't really doing those things. It was more like they're funding the people who are compatible enough with their interests, who are already going to kind of do the things and say the things that they generally want them to do. You don't have to shake someone down if you find the right person to pay. So one of the most famous journals that came out of this was a well-known intellectual journal called Encounter, which was edited by Irving Kristol, who became the godfather of neoconservatism. Neoconservatives are a very important group for my research here. So after these exposés and the CIA operations being uncovered in the 60s and 70s, the elite politicians and intelligence agents and people in business and government felt the need to recalibrate things. Even back in the 50s, CIA agents were talking about how it might be better if we funded some of these organizations that we're funding covertly now. It might be better if we funded them overtly instead, because if things get uncovered, then it's going to be a major problem for us. So some of the early neoconservatives were involved in these cultural Cold War efforts, like Irving Kristol here, but also who would become the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl Gershman, came out of this milieu as well. It started off as a kind of a Trotskyist or an anti-Soviet socialist, and the Young People's Socialist League, which was affiliated with the Socialist Party of America. They kind of led a right-wing revolt within the Socialist Party and renamed it as Social Democrats USA. And they were also involved, a lot of them writing for Freedom House and being kind of house academics there, which is where a lot of neoconservatives would work. At the same time, you had elite foreign policy advisors like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, and as well as Samuel P. Huntington, who got together and wrote and discussed how we can, in the wake of the civil rights movement, how this uprising of democracy that they saw during the civil rights movement during the 1960s could be made safe, essentially, for imperialism and U.S. capitalism. And much of this discussion was done in these elite foreign policy forums, like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, which were heavily funded by oil money. So under the Reagan administration, this is where this new democracy promotion apparatus comes into being. That's when the National Endowment for Democracy is created. And USAID is a little bit older, but it essentially takes on some of the same roles that the NED is creating. They also create several core grantees. There's the National Democratic Institute, which was affiliated with the Democratic Party and was headed by Madeleine Albright until she died, and the International Republican Institute, affiliated with the Republican Party, headed by John McCain until he died. You also have the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is affiliated with the business communities, and the Solidarity Center, affiliated with the AFL-CIO, which was heavily involved in the CIA's old labor union schemes back in the 50s and 60s. That many activists referred to the AFL-CIO during this time as the AFL-CIA. So their mission essentially was to create democracies abroad in the image of America. So they would train foreign political parties in the image of the Democratic and Republican parties. They would train labor unions and fund labor unions in the image of American labor unions. And we're especially concerned with making sure that their favorite unions and their favorite political parties won out in local politics and national politics over labor unions that might be too radical, might be too anti-American in some ways. So some of the first things the NED and USAID get involved in the 1980s were the Iran-Contra affair. At the same time that the CIA was funding the Contras and bringing tons and tons of weapons to them, the NED and USAID were helping to support the electoral opposition to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, supporting anti-Sandinista labor unions and journalistic associations and newspapers, all sorts of civil society and media groups. At the same time, also in the Reagan administration, you had Operation Cyclone, the largest CIA operation in its history, backing the Salafi Afghan Mujahideen. And perhaps most famously, USAID spent millions, I think $60 million, to create these Mujahideen and CIA-approved USAID-funded children's textbooks, basically teaching the values of religious fundamentalism to young Afghan and Pakistani children at this time. And people may remember the ending scene of Rambo 3, the original one, before it was edited out, said this film is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan. So how this stuff kind of gets its way into the popular culture is also very interesting for my research here. So I want to bring this up to some of the present. Something I've written a good deal on so far and done a lot of research on is NED, USAID operations, and CIA operations in Syria. So similar to what they were doing in Afghanistan in the 1980s, they had something called Operation Timber Sycamore, where they supported fundamentalist religious groups that were very sectarian and attacked Shia and Kurdish populations in Syria. people like al-Zenki and Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam, these militia groups that were Sunni Arab and thought that Syria is a place only for Sunni Arabs and Sunni Arab men in particular. Here's a map of some of the civil society and media operations that they had in Syria, and this is around 2015. These are from leaked documents that came out from some of these British government contractors that were working on these operations during the 2010s. Those documents were just leaked a couple years ago. They created a group called the White Helmets, which became a key propaganda outlet for these operations, supporting these militias that the CIA was supporting. And it eventually turned into a Oscar-winning 2016 documentary, which I traced the kind of political economy, how this thing was produced, and all the oil and intelligence money that went into its production. Last thing to end with, I'm interested in looking at also Venezuela from basically the election of Hugo Chavez up until the present. These are in many ways still ongoing things that are still continuing. So before the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, you had NED and USAID started heavily funding some of these civil society and media groups that were against Chavez and encouraging opposition to him. They funded student organizations, which the leader of the opposition eventually came out of, Juan Guaido, who declared himself the interim president of Venezuela during a constitutional crisis, and only just lost that title. They also funded anti-government music concerts and song contests during the 2010s. And perhaps again, looking at how this influences pop culture, Amazon, which has also connections with intelligence agencies, one of their biggest shows, in fact, it was their biggest show for a while, Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan, its second season, is about how the CIA is about a fictionalized CIA effort to bring democracy to Venezuela. So that's introduction to my dissertation that I'm starting on, and looking forward to any of your questions. Oh, wow, I didn't go. Nice. Want to get a little bit back on track. We're running a little late.
Yeah,
Okay.
if there's not any questions, we can take a short break and start with panel 3.
Yeah, so any questions for me or Jake?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question is, like, are there other examples that you're from sort of else of comment? I remember when I was in college, the ponies well, like,
Yeah.
Give a damn about any type of activism or activists all of a sudden overnight. We're like, and you know, so I think like there were like oil reserves discovered in I think Rwanda, Uganda, and it's just very convenient.
Oh yeah.
So you know, I'm just curious as to like how did you select your examples? Because I feel like there's so many examples from Tony to war in Libya and how Libya has turned out today. So many others.
Yeah, so those are the examples I gave are just kind of like the earliest examples and the latest examples. There's a lot more in between that and a lot of stuff still going on. Some other prominent ones are Yugoslavia during the 1990s, or basically like Serbia at the time, because it was basically like, it still called itself Yugoslavia, but it was essentially just Serbia by that time. In the wake of the NATO bombing over Kosovo, USAID and NED funded, like really heavily backed the opposition and had all sorts of crazy schemes to try to undermine Milosevic and back the opposition, make sure that they won the 2000 election. You had various what were called color revolutions throughout Eastern Europe, which were heavily inspired and involved a lot of people who were either trained by USAID and NED or were trained by the people who were trained by them. So they kind of like, they train the trainers. That's a term they like to use a lot. So this was in like Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2006 or 7, and then again. They were very important for the Euromaidan coup in 2014, and also did things. Iran was a big target for a long time. They fund opposition groups in anywhere that America doesn't like the current government. So there are a lot of governments that the U.S. doesn't like. They fund the opposition, the political opposition in those countries.
Follow-up question. So there's like a resurgent socialist movement in the United States, with the Democratic Socialists of America and many other socialist formations. Is there any like correlation or layover or spillover effects from this like previous, probably continuing like government sponsored socialism, I guess, with the CIA?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you'd be surprised some of the people that the CIA and some of these groups were willing to work with. They were willing to work with plenty of people who had all sorts of left-wing positions, as long as they were not very anti-NATO or not anti-NATO really at all. Had to make sure that they were anti-Soviet, and today, say like anti-Chinese. Just like make sure that they aligned with the basic premises of American foreign policy. And some of the like Bernie Sanders and I believe maybe Michael Harrington as well, founder of the DSA, we're involved in like the Young People's Socialist League with like Carl Gershman, some of these folks. That doesn't necessarily mean they were like funded or supported by the CIA personally, but there has been this decades-long project to create a left that is compatible, or it is not too much of a threat to American imperialism specifically, like American imperialism generally. But no, that's that's a great question. It does have influence. Any other questions?
Let's run around real quick. You need a short break.